good afternoon, or good morning, whatever time you're watching us today. I hope you've been enjoying the stories that I've talked about so far and told and shared with you, and shared with you how my great-grandfather, Pap Grisham, brought these stories from the mountains of Kentucky all the way from back in Scotland and Ireland and England and Germany. You know, stories are kind of a conglomeration. That's a big fancy highfalutin word for means a group of the ideas that are put together in a particular way, in an interesting way that grabs the attention, and they're designed for different ideas and different purposes. Can you imagine? Close your eyes for just a minute and think. Think back 2,000 years ago, actually a little more than 2,000 years ago. Almost all the living human beings lived in an area around North Africa and in southern Europe and around the Mediterranean Sea. And not many of those people had any education at all. In fact, they had not even formed a basic alphabet or a basic way to keep records of their thoughts. But there would be always somebody in a tribe of people that would sit down in the late afternoon and kind of build up the fire a little bit and put a little kindling on the fire and take an old oak log and pull it up. Now, they knew about nature. They knew about things that happened to them every day, and they would look up at night and wonder, what in the world are all those fires doing in the sky? And they could look and see the twinkling and the shattering, and maybe if it was raining, they could hear the rumble of the thunder as it thundered across the sky. And they certainly could see the moon on a beautiful clear night as it slid lovely across the sky, as if she was whispering secrets that she wanted to share with us. And then in day, they could see the thundering and hear the thundering of the horses. Apollo was pulling his great chariot right across the west, from the east, across the sky to the west. And they began to name these creatures because those people fully believed, and some of them today still believe this sort of thing, that everything in nature has a beautiful way of expressing self, because everything had a spirit. And if there was a great tree that stood out in the pasture land, and they looked, the tree would have a spirit that you could go and maybe talk to the tree, or sing a song to the tree, because you honored all living things with a way to express themselves, so that everybody could appreciate the spirit of the whole world. Now, there wasn't many people that lived at this time, and nobody kept a record of this, but like I told you a while ago, there's always somebody, and it might be a woman, old as I, that assumed that she had a special ability of telling you how to look at things and see what the spirit of that thing was, and how you could see how a certain river might have a spirit of its own. And she was always telling you about these things. And you began to say, you know, I'll bet that's a very wise woman. Or if it were a man, you might say, he has great power. He has the power of leadership, because he can tell you about things that were to the past, or things that are to the future, or all the many things that he had a great power. And in the late afternoon, he'd start building up a fire, right, and here would come all the people in the village, because it usually was just a small village of people. Later, those villages became small little towns, and later those small little towns became cities, and then the later the cities became, oh, this was time progressed, and people progressed, but they still listened to those people who they would sit around, and maybe a little person over close to the let's call him the man that's going to be telling the story is a powerful, that we give him the title of wizard or maybe male witch. But anyway, he had great power and people listened to him. And one of the children might say, "Sir, what do you think, where do you think Apollo came from?" And he would look up with great wisdom and knew his power, because he had the power to convince people that he could do things that ordinary people couldn't do. He says, "Well, best I think that might be the son of one of the gods." And the child would say, "What do you mean?" He said, "Oh, everything's got a spirit, and some of them are more powerful. The very powerful spirits we refer to as gods, and their wives would be goddesses, and the people that they would have a relationship with each other." And he said, "You know what? I'll bet you he named that son Apollo, which means that he's the chariot of the sky. And every day his responsibility is to drive that great team of 12 horses right across the sky. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the thundering of the hoofs as they thunder across the sky." And the children look up. Ooh, they had no idea that there would be such power. In fact, he said, the gods probably were, well, the highest point around this area was in Greece, and there was the mountain of Olympia. And Olympia was the tallest mountain there. And he said, "I'll bet you the gods live right up at the tip top of Olympia. And there they live in great, great palaces that are built by mankind to honor them. And Vesuvius, all these places, they built these places up in the mountaintops." And he says, "Oh, can't you imagine? They would have great dinners, and they would send people out to hunt for deer, and they would have great things going." The king of the gods' name was Saturn. Saturn was the king. And later, when Greece and Rome, the two cities, they began to get in an argument. One of them called the great god Jupiter, and one called him Saturn, but they alluded that they were the very. And so began what we refer to, we authors and we writers, and we people that are living today, we refer to these people as the classical beginning of literature. And so they begin stories about the relation, because in their mind, the gods and the goddesses and their offspring had power to have relationships with each other and make stories about. For instance, they created all sorts, like Hercules. Now, Hercules, according to the old classical literature, was a man that was very, very strong. He was one of our heroes. That today, you might talk about your heroes being Superman or Spider-Man or and we still make up stories about heroes and put them in comic books and put them in books and things like that. Well, they made up stories about Hercules. And in the stories of Hercules, he was always one of the strongest of the gods. But the thing was, he was only half mortal. Now that's a word you want to remember, mortal, because if a creature was a mortal creature, he would have to die someday. Well, Hercules was not a true god. He was half god, but his mother was a mortal woman. Well, the king of the land was very, very jealous of what Hercules could do, And he was always making up things to send Hercules out. Now, Hercules was very proud that he was strong and able to fight off the great things that were causing people. For instance, there was a creature out at the edge of the earth. Now, notice I said that because we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's a creature out there that had 100 heads out in the water. And when some mortal creature came close in a boat, he would raise one of those heads up out of the water, and here come 99 more right following, and they would completely kill and devour whomever had the audacity to come to the edge of the earth. Why? He ought to keep his mortal self on land and not go out and get entangled in situations that he had no power over. So Hercules decided he was going to rid the world of this horrible Crimea. And he took himself a sword, and out he went. And sure enough, there was one of the awfulest battles you ever heard. In fact, they still talk about it at the top of Mount Olympia. And they still tell about how Hercules cut off one head and another head till he had completely decapitated every one of the heads of the great Crimea. And the world celebrated his great victory and praised him, and probably built him a temple somewhere over in Rome or Greece to honor him. And they told this story they told about him going through the underground down in the land of Pluto, and against Pluto's will. And Pluto sent great giant spiders. And you know, and I know, spiders, they might be tiny to us, but at that time, if they were created by the gods, they could be as big as a blimp. They could be as big as what we would refer to as a jet plane. And then they could come and seek out whatever living thing was caught in their great webs down underneath the city of Greece and then into the cities of Rome. And so Hercules had one power after another challenged, and he went to solve it. Well, the king, who didn't particularly like Hercules, kept thinking, I've got to make up a bunch of tasks. Now, that's a word for you to remember. A task is not something we use very much, but a long time ago, a task would be a place or a thing or a job that would be particularly hard to do, maybe even impossible to do. And they only had set their heroes to that. So now the king thought, what task can I send Hercules to do that he certainly would be killed? And he thought, I know, the tree that bears the golden apples. Oh, people today are still looking, because at the very beginning of time, we gods created a great garden. And right in the middle of that great garden, we had a tree. And that tree bore fruit that were made of solid gold. And they would be very, very valuable and very, very powerfully. And everybody, gods and mortal people too, wanted a basket of the fruit that were made of solid gold that gave that individual great power. So indeed, the king called Hercules, and he said, Hercules, he says, you claim you can do all things? He says, it's time for you to take on this task for me. And he says, I want you to go out into the world and find the garden where the tree bears the golden fruit of immortality, and bring me a basket of that fruit back. Well, Hercules was not real sure where the Garden of Immortality was, and he certainly wasn't sure what the tree would look like. But now, he was rather proud of himself, and I hate to tell you this, but he didn't mind kind of lying a little bit. So he finally agreed with the king that he would go and bring back a basket of golden fruit that gave that king great power and great ability to do anything on earth he wanted to do. He said, and the king told him, says, Hercules, be looking for the character that we call Atlas. And Hercules kind of paused because he had heard of Atlas. Atlas was one of the more powerful of gods, and he had a very special assignment. He was the god that held the earth in place. He was the god that made sure that earth itself didn't go spinning out into space or go down into volcano pits and be consumed up. He carried the weight of the earth on his shoulders at all times, right out in the middle of an island in the ocean. Now Hercules borrowed a boat without the owner's permission, which might have been a mistake. You know, it's always a mistake to borrow things without the permission of the owner. But he did not even stop to consider the consequences of what he might do. Indeed, he started rowing out to the island in the middle of the ocean. And before he got there, sure enough, he could see it looked like the shadow of a great mountain that was being borne up into space by this being that was all humped over. It looked as if the being had a great ball on his back, and he got closer and closer, and sure enough, you might not believe this, but sure enough, the man stood up, and he was as big as the mountain himself, and indeed, he had this gigantic ball resting on his shoulders, and he was powered over, and he looked extremely tired, and he looked down and saw Hercules coming rowing up on this boat, and he said, "Who are you?" Well, Hercules was used to having a little more respect than that, and he said, "Sir, I'm named by the gods as Hercules." "Oh, I've heard about you, little man. I've heard how strong you are and how you can take care of me things. But there are some things that you, being only half mortal, cannot do. You cannot take on the responsibility of taking care of Earth, that it doesn't go streaming out into space to destroy everything on it, or it can go tumbling down into the innards of the earth where the volcanoes are massing and boiling and bubbling and creating destruction and death." Oh, indeed, Hercules thought. He could not do either one of those things. But he says, "What in the world?" He said, "Sir, I'm looking for the garden that bears the fruit tree in it, that has fruit that is solid gold and gives the owner great power and permission to be in control of all things. Do you know where it is? I've looked the world over, and I've not found it anywhere." Well, Atlas wasn't above being sort of laughing at either. He says, "Well, indeed, I've heard of it, and I might know a little bit about it," alluding to the fact that he might know more than he really did. I have to tell you this. But he says, "Well, I'll tell you what, little man. If if you assume that you can hold the weight of the world on your shoulder, I will be delighted for you to take this and hold it, and I will go fetch the basket of fruit for you, and I will bring them back and give them to you, and you will not have to go through the turmoil and the danger involved gathering the fruit in the basket. Well, Hercules was a fairly intelligent young man, and he says, well, you know, I think I would be strong enough to hold the world on my shoulders. That's no problem, he says. But how long do you think? Oh, not long, not over, a short period of time it would be. He says, why don't you climb up the mountain slope here? And when your shoulders get up even with my shoulders, we'll ooch earth over on your shoulders, and you will be completely responsible for it until I go get the fruit and I return. Well, again, like I told you, Hercules was not considering the consequences of his decision. He thought, you know, I can do that, and it would simplify things, and I'd be able to take the fruit, and my task would be completed. So he began to climb. If you and I had been there, we could have told him he ought to think, because just as soon as he got up where his shoulders were the same height as Atlas's shoulders, Atlas ooched earth on it and on his bare back. And he thought, ooh, I had no idea how heavy earth is. Indeed, said Atlas, who was stretching because, good heavens, he had not stretched his muscles in eons of time. And he said, and that's not the only thing. Don't you dare sneeze or cough or anything like that. Don't you dare do that, because if you do, Earth will either go plummeting out into space or down into the eons below the land. Oh, you've got to take your responsibilities very, very seriously, just like we do have to take responsibility of our actions today. Indeed, he settled down and he watched Atlas walk toward the west until nothing was seen except the very top of his head, because indeed it looked as if the ocean kind of made a curve instead of being shaped like a plate, which most people thought at the time. And indeed, there Atlas was, holding up Earth itself and every living thing on it. And he did that for the day, and the next day, and the next week, and the next month. Had Atlas been taken advantage of? Was Atlas going to be there forever? And when a couple of eons, you need to check with your library to see how long an eon is. In a couple of eons, he looked out at the horizon and he saw just the top of a head, and then the shoulders, and then the body. It's Atlas returning, and he had a basket of golden fruit in his hand, and he was laughing and thought, but he intended to trick. He got up, he said, Atlas. He said, indeed, Hercules. He said, let me put these in your boat, and then, by the way, in just another eon or two, I'll come back, and I haven't had as much freedom. I haven't found out how much it was. Oh, indeed. He says, I'll be back, And you have done such a good job. You've taken your responsibility so closely. Thank you, thank you. Hercules thought, I don't want to stay here any longer. He says, well, I appreciate that. I appreciate your saying that I did a real good job, but he said, right back here underneath this area, about where Italy's toe meets the red, he said, I've got a raw place. He said, if you will hold it just a minute, I'll take this big lion pelt up and pull it under where that raw place is so it will no longer chafe me, and then I'll take it back. Well, Atlas made the mistake of thinking that Hercules would not lie. Just as we make that mistake quite often sometime when we think people are telling the absolute truth, and we find out they kind of stretch the truth a little bit. Indeed, he said, indeed. But nevertheless, he pretended to agree. And sure enough, Atlas reached down and got earth and pulled it back on his shoulder just for a second. And the minute that earth left his back and the responsibility was pulled away, indeed, he jumped from the slab that he was on halfway up the mountain into the boat and began, and he waved back. He said, thank you kindly, Mr. Atlas. Thank you very, very kindly. And again, I'll visit you again. And he watched him. He said, oh, daddammit. He said, I did think I had found some fool to accept my responsibility. So if you go looking for the area where the earth is taken care of, to find Atlas, go into the library and ask your librarian, ma'am, have we got an atlas in here? Because then all of the things on earth are kept in those big books that we refer to as atlas, because Hercules accepted task after assignment, and is still, if you look real carefully on television, you'll find stories that Walt Disney puts on television all about the heroic deeds. In fact, I saw one about a week ago about a giant that had two heads. And if I'm not badly mistaken, I told you a story about how Jack conquered the giant with two heads. Be looking for things, but watch. Even today, yesterday, they shot a rocket out into space. Did you know that rocket has the name of one of the gods and goddesses that were thought up 2,000 years ago? When you're writing a story, build yourself a skeleton first. It might be a skeleton of a god or goddess, a skeleton like Hercules. It could be anybody that you wanted to tell about, or it might be a modern day astronaut. There's stories everywhere you look, boys and girls. Search for them because they are very, very interesting. Thank you for listening.